We have three different and unique perspectives based off of what they're working on in the privacy and security space. So with that, I'll leave it off to Tiger. Thanks.
All right, it's great to be back up here, everyone. Just as a reminder, my name is Tiger Morgan. I'm Chief of Staff of Every. I work with Jonathan, and I was super thrilled to host the last panel, and I'm even more thrilled to host this one. You know, one of the biggest things that we're trying to do in the blockchain space is create open and transparent and trustless systems and architectures between each other, but with that comes a significant amount of security behind it. And so we've got some amazing speakers here who are going to be talking about their different aspects of security, three great different perspectives. So why don't we just go down the line and introduce yourselves, everyone.
I'm Tamara Rodgers. I'm General Counsel for Pithia, and we are a blockchain VC company. So I've been fortunate to see and interact with a bunch of different blockchain companies, and I spent a lot of time exploring the legal aspects and issues around the blockchain space, so cybersecurity, privacy, securities, etc.
I'm Maximo, co-founder and CTO of Concreit. We are building a securities token to collateralize commercial real estate and make it more accessible for everyday investors.
My name is Jesse Adams. I'm the founder and co-founder and CEO of Tenta Browser. We're building the browser of the future, and it's private and encrypted by default. Before Tenta, I'm also founder of MyCandy, which is an adult app store. It's not safe for work, but that experience, we have 16 million customers. We learned a lot about privacy and security on mobile and how to protect people's content when it's so personal. And so those things are lessons we learned a lot when building Tenta.
So I'd like to touch on this panel on some technical aspects and also just kind of some user interface and more ideological aspects. But kind of to get things kicked off, I'd like to know if you guys have any good stories or experiences you'd like to share about security breaches, either in or out of the blockchain space, or just some of the things you guys have experienced in your time working in the security space, and just great ghost stories.
So founders and I, we've lost money in Mt. Gox. Second question is, how much?
That's a good ghost story.
The answer is, don't worry about it. And then actually, the most recent story that's kind of fun for me is, like, you guys heard the recent hack with SpankChain. And the person called the company, called the founder and say, hey, it was me. I'll return the money, but here's how I did it. So it had a happy ending, but that's a kind of a cool story. I just learned about that because I met the guys in San Francisco Blockchain Week last week. And so they told me about that. So that's a good, I thought that was a cool story.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there's some that I can't talk about, but I'll talk about one. In my previous company, I built security solutions for Microsoft Skype for Business. And one of my clients, they're mostly banks. One of my clients was is the National Laboratory of Los Alamos. And what was really interesting about them is they get hacked because they're a nuclear plant, right? So you got all these other foreign countries who want to steal our nuclear plants, how they build it, and they get hit 10,000 times a day, which was really impressive. So that was fun.
Spooky.
All right, I certainly don't have anything on that level. I was doing some research recently, and I learned that there is a type of attack that has been targeted towards certain blockchains in which, and these have tended to have been small chains without not very high profile, where hackers have managed to get 51% of their nodes, and then they've essentially held the platform hostage, demanded a certain amount of Ethereum or Bitcoin, and if they weren't paid, they would fork. And I can't remember the names of the two that were mentioned in this particular article, but this was a form of hacking that I was unaware of, but that seems like something that people should be paying attention to, especially as they're building their own independent platforms or even running a smart contract.
So to kind of go into the ideological side of the pool here, I spent about 20 or so days in China a couple months ago. And for those of you who haven't been there, it's absolutely a post-privacy society. Here in the United States, we value privacy very highly, and we take that very seriously. And I think a lot of these blockchain things that people come up with in solutions, including yours, Jesse, is really aimed at that personal privacy and security. Yeah. Do you think that we are doomed to go down the path of a post-privacy society, or do you think that we live in the kind of world where we can kind of achieve personal right and responsibility over privacy in perpetuity?
Yeah, so I think that's one freedom where you can't take for granted. And a lot of times it's one of those freedoms where you worry about when it's too late. So it's already happening. You know, it's not on that severe level of Black Mirror like in China, but it is sort of happening now. I mean, there are some dark patterns with Facebook and Chrome. You don't realize how much you're giving away. Even on Google search, when you're typing something, even if you don't hit enter, they're still recording it. So things like that. They're selling, you know, even large companies are buying your credit card line items so they can see your purchases and tie it to the advertising. So all that stuff's happening in the background. You're not sure you're giving it away. So we call that dark patterns. When you're signing the TOS, you don't realize you're doing it. So it's one of those things where you have to actively be a participant in fighting back for it. So I think the crypto revolution in large part is a rejection of that version of the future. Yeah. So I would say and you have to be active participant for 3 reasons. One is software is only getting more complicated. It doesn't get simpler. As you guys know, if you buy any kind of crypto today, it's so much more personal responsibility on behalf of the user to actually make sure your stuff is safe. Second, leading to that is because it's more complicated, threats are crazier. So even if 95% of all the hacks in the world are script kiddies, that 5%, they're so smart, they're giving away these like basically cyber weapons for free, or not free, but online. You can buy them. Anybody can buy them. So even the most worst programmer can get a pretty hardcore weapon. And so that leads into the third issue, which is BYOD, was bring your own device. So everyone's phone is now your work phone and your personal device. So even if you don't think you're personally going to be under attack, your company probably is, and everyone's company is, and it's not even a personal attack anymore. It's just bots, just millions of bots just constantly finding a weakness all day long. And so you have to be an active participant to protect it.
Now, Tamara, I want to direct this one at you. Very few people will ever be active participants when people create such seamless and useful user interactions like Facebook and YouTube. Do you think that with the crypto revolution that's currently going on and will go on for a long time, privacy and security will become adopted in the ethos of technology and user experiences of the future? Or do you think this is just set to be another subset of major industries kind of pushing that to the side again?
Well, I think a lot of it is going to be user-driven. As we've seen in Europe with the GDPR, the impetus to pass that legislation came from somewhere. America has obviously a very different political system and has a tendency to be a little bit contentious within it. But I think that until there's a movement that will probably have to start with companies whereby they make privacy the default, we are going to continue to go, as consumers, go the easiest route. And so I think that until there's sufficient reason for the creators of software and including the enterprise level to install privacy as the default, then it's going to continue to kind of, as you said, move off to the side. America is a little too preoccupied with its other issues at the moment to make a strong stand or push towards it. And it's just simply too easy at this point to continue along the path of least resistance.
Now, just diving into the GDPR really quick, and this is a quick question. Do you think GDPR and blockchain technologies will kind of mature together and reach a union, or do you think they'll be antagonistic towards each other with stuff like the right to be forgotten, which is kind of hard to achieve when it's an immutable record, right?
I recently read a paper, or not a paper, but it was what one of the French agencies had put forth. And they're looking at ways to make the two work together. No one wants to throw out either technology. The fact that there isn't yet a definitive method that the GDPR is going to be, in how it's going to interact with blockchain, is only because there hasn't yet been a sufficient use case. There's not anyone really using a blockchain-based service in the EU that is pressing on the GDPR hard enough that there's been a definitive answer. So a lot of what I saw in the reading I did, and the source noted that this had been an informal translation, so a formal translation from the French may be slightly different, but a lot of it was coming down towards continuing to narrow the definitions of what would be, I think, a producer or a user of the specific data, and then putting the stringent requirements upon those. And then this article was looking less at the technical aspects, but from sort of the higher level, the first impressions, it's going to be a lot of resorting to things like zero knowledge proofs, storing the actual data off chain so that it can be removed. It's going to have to be reconciled at some point, and that is going to have to come from a very high level. It may be through court systems, it may be through legislation, but it hasn't obviously come to a head yet because we're not seeing any sort of really definitive guidance on it.
That's a great answer. That's a great answer. Now, talking a little bit more on the technological side, Rui, you're an amazing architect of smart contracts, and you've got a depth of knowledge and experience in the space. When it comes to writing your DApp or your project or building your blockchain-based protocol, what are areas of security that you first undertake if you're working on a project to make sure that your blockchain is going to be secured from malcontents? And then what are some of the more niche aspects that you've come across and areas that you try and think about when you're architecting a little further down the road?
Well, first of all, thank you, but that's not exactly true. So when I architect a DApp, I basically start, it's different. It's a different model. So because there's 3 different layers, essentially. You got the smart contract layer, you got the off-chain, which includes your back end, and then you got your front end, which would be either mobile or web. And so the way by practice is the way I do it is I start by the smart contracts. And I look at what makes sense to put on the blockchain, what doesn't make sense to put on the blockchain. And then I go from there. I just stack the layers, and then I make sure that that is secure. Because once you deploy the smart contract, it's there forever. So you want to try to make it as upgradable as possible and modular, so that you can switch out parts of it, parts of the architecture through smart contracts. And then you have the back-end piece that's going to be talking to the smart contracts. And so the question is, do you want to make your smart contracts accessible to everybody, or are you the administrator of the smart contracts, and therefore only certain API calls are accessible through you because you have the private key to that? Of course, the back-end needs to be secured no matter what, depending on whatever you use, but that's just your traditional model. And then, of course, then you have your user experience, which is going to be calling your backend through REST-based APIs or webhooks or whatever those are. And those also have to be secured because you're not going to allow anybody to access it. If you allow anybody access, then that obviously has to be information that you're willing to give out publicly. But if it's something that belongs to the user, then you need to enforce logins. So you have to enforce some kind of authentication process there with using OAuth. So that's basically the model that I work through.
Brilliant, brilliant.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah.
So another thing, if you're building it yourself or you're hiring someone, one thing like in software you always kind of do too late is automated testing and automated verification testing, and so that happens too late. But with Solidity and blockchain code, there's not that much code, especially when you're starting, that's actually on the blockchain. So to do these automated testing, it's not like you can do it. It's not a huge code base yet, right? So maximum input +1, minimum input +1. Like, if you don't do it yourself, at least ask the people you hire, are you doing this yourself? And then just mention that question, because a lot of times it's neglected or you wait too late. Yeah, so that I would say that, and it's good to do it early because, like I said, the actual code that's on the blockchain, it will be minimal at first. A lot of it's going to live off the chain.
Yeah, let me add to that. That's absolutely correct. Like the smart contracts, I always write the test cases for it. They're automated. And you have to remember, garbage in, garbage out, right? So you always throw in stuff, and you want to make sure that and the same principles of security that apply offline or off-chain also apply on-chain. So you're always sanitizing the input parameters, making sure that it is what you're expecting before you do any transactions or operations on those. So same thing.
Do you agree, Tamara?
The technical info is way past my level of understanding.
So one thing I know I asked you beforehand and just would love for you to comment on. I know it's not your area of expertise, but something I think you might be able to talk to better than almost anybody in the room is, what are the legal ramifications on companies if you don't take the time to do these security checks or you leave yourself vulnerable to hacks? I mean, are you kind of leaving yourself out there to hang if someone does something really malicious to you? Or are you protected? Talk me through that a little bit.
So if you're aware of the fact that you're vulnerable to a hack and that you're holding data that, should it be exposed, you would therefore be on the hook for, and obviously the loss of money, the loss of financial data, the loss of personal information, credit score, stuff like that, is all something that we as a culture have agreed both morally and legally is a problem. So there's best practices that one can follow in order to keep things safe and secure. You can you need to do an assessment of what your risk areas are. You need to have a plan to comply with best practices. You need to have a plan for what to do if something is compromised. How do you continue operations while at the same time attempting to mitigate? How do you go through your process of notifying the affected parties, notifying law enforcement? So from a liability point of view, and I haven't looked deeply to see if there's specific cases in which someone was brought up or a suit was brought for negligence whereby someone claimed, you failed to take appropriate steps and you lost this data. They may be out there, but there is certainly a liability attached when there's a established best practice or an established means by which to test yourself for risks and to prevent it, and then you fail to do so. For instance, Mt. Gox in 2011 was hacked, and they lost about $8 million. And prior to that, they had someone who had interviewed and had discovered that they hadn't done any sort of testing. They had a centralized pathway for all code. It was all being run through one CEO. And they had no versioning control, so they didn't know who was checking in software or when or who was pulling it back out again. So in 2011, they lose $8 million, and then in 2014, they clearly haven't remedied these problems, and they lose $470 million. So, Mt. Gox obviously took its knocks and suffered through it all. If that had happened here in the US, someone might have looked at that first hack, and then upon the second hack, might have gone after them and said, well, we're going to actually hold you guys responsible for that lost money because you had reason to know that you were not holding to the highest possible standard of cybersecurity. And here in the US, and I really can't speak abroad because I'm a US attorney, not international, there's a number of different agencies that may come after you in the wake of a cybersecurity breach. You can have the FCC, you can have the CFTC, you can have the SEC, you can have shareholders if you're a corporation, you can have plaintiffs who were members who had their data stolen or their money stolen. There's even the state attorney general's offices and the Department of Justice. They've all kind of taken swings at people who have made major missteps on the data breaches. And then once you put aside all of those legal questions, you still have the massive PR problem that comes with a data breach. So I think we all are aware of, like Equifax and some of those, and there wasn't, at least in my opinion, a strong enough stance from the Justice Department on some of those. But we as consumers are not happy about this, and probably many of us have taken action on our own personal behalf to remove our data. So there's a lot of liability that comes with it. It's not like there's one singular agency that comes down and applies it. It can come from a myriad of directions, and then the amount of fault attributed may come down to whether or not it was a foreseeable hack or breach.
So I think we're going to go to the audience right now and ask a couple questions. Is there anybody in the audience who's interested in blockchain security or has some things you want to either add to the conversation or kind of pick our experts' brains on? Then we got one right there.
Hi. So we're about to get involved with developing the apps on blockchain. Where does the hack begins? From the front end or coders? Is it happening because most of the people outsource these codes?
I'll go ahead. So it really depends where your weakest point is. That's where it is, right? So you're as strong as your weakest point, and that could be your smart contract if you didn't secure that properly, or it could be your back end. Those are usually your main points. Your front end is not really going to be that much of an issue, depending on how you code it. But if you're about to write a DApp, what I recommend you do, obviously you're going to write your DApp, you're going to have to write your test cases on it. Definitely recommend you have that code audited. If you have the time and the funds to do it, put it out for competition. So open up to hackers to go and look at it. Make sure you publish your code base so it's public. So that would be on the smart contract side of things. On your back end, you're probably going to have a back end. You want to make sure you have that as well audited. If you're going to have it cloud-based, whether it's on AWS or Azure or Google Cloud, you want to bring in some experts who know those platforms in and out and can help you adopt best practices, like put an API gateway in front of it, secure your instances, your networking, lock it all down, right? So you want to lock it down. You got to go with the principle of least permissions and least access, and create containerized, okay? And then from a user perspective is all your entry points. So you have a surface area of attack, essentially, right? So those are all your entry points, whether it's APIs or interfaces, and you want to lock all of those down. It's a lot of work, but it is necessary.
One follow-up question. So we're talking about public nodes and private node permissions. Which one do you think is safer for enterprise?
So you're talking about public or private blockchains?
Correct.
The answer to your question really depends on your use case.
For enterprise model, meaning managing insurance certificates, managing staff private information. You don't want to put that on the blockchain.
So better way to think about that would be first you kind of do a thought experiment and say, okay, what's the most important assets, whether it's even your own individual digital stuff or your company, what's important for you? What can you afford to lose? What you can afford not to lose? What would be the most damage if someone took it, or what would be the most damage if someone had control over it and you couldn't get access to it anymore? So you do that thought experiment first. So because at the end of the day, yeah, it's overwhelming. So you have a finite amount of resources. So you have to define what your most important assets are. So that's why that matters first. It's not whether public or private. It's more like what's the most important assets? How could someone screw that up? And then you can decide put your resources there first. Because you can't do everything. Like there's no way to reduce risk completely. But that's that. So and then the other mantra is good is don't trust anyone, including yourself, but distribute the trust to mitigate the risk. So the idea of having someone else audit your code, that's just basically you're distributing the trust instead of just one guy or one person that coded it up. You can distribute the trust. So I think that's probably a better way of looking at it is, doing that thought experiment, and even with yourself. Ask yourself what am I doing right now to protect it? Since you're building your own dApp, and if you say if your answers are change my passwords, delete cookies, only use known sites. If that's your answer for the top 3 things you can do, that's not enough. There's way more things. So a cybersecurity person would say something different. Another thing I would say, just super useful, there's really cheap, $15 programs on Udemy on cybersecurity, which are awesome. I've recommended to friends, just crash course, they're great. Yeah, so I would do that too.
One more question. Do we have one more question? All right, I think we'll
One there.
Oh, right there, Brock again, my man.
Sort of the elephant in the room here in some sense. I've heard the word China a couple of times during this token forum, yet, and I think one of you mentioned it, Tiger, maybe it was you, but yet, really, that's complete opposite of privacy and security. So if we talk about wanting to build great privacy and security, which I think is a really foundational issue for protecting our democracy, yet that runs smack dab into right now the government in China and what they want to control. So, I mean, what are the trade-offs there if, for companies that say, oh, we want to take Chinese money or we want to stand up things in China because of that huge approach difference between privacy and security as we want to see it and maybe what they don't want to see?
What's the 1 minute answer of that, or 30 seconds on that?
Real quick, there's 2 versions of the internet that are being built right now, and especially if you're in the cybersecurity world, it freaks you out. That's probably the biggest, scariest thing. There's nothing really us can do about it. But I think the best thing is we build our version of the internet, and it'll be so compelling that it will win. I don't see how you can, because the government has really just wholeheartedly embraced how powerful AI is. For us, AI is all about commerce and buying stuff. For them, it's controlling how you think. And they're just completely owning it, and they know how awesome it is, and that's just their version of the internet. So I don't know what else we can do about it, but build a better version and bring people over. Yeah, taking people's money from there, that I'd be careful about, because if it's tied to a government, then you might have to just give up your. I don't know. There's like ramifications. So yeah, be careful who you sell your soul to.
All right, let's give him a round of applause, everybody. Thank you. Thank you so much.